Kwai, Segon, welcome everybody. My name is Julie de Pelto. I'm a Quebecois settler, originally from Joliette, and I've been teaching political science at Kiuna for now 4 years. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to this conference, and it's my honor to introduce our distinguished guest, Taiaiake Alfred. I'll say a few words about his bio. So he is a Kanyangaga philosopher, writer, governance consultant, and political strategist. His work centers on the design and development of the institutions of Indigenous governance, Indigenous resurgence and self-determination, and the revitalization of Indigenous political systems. Also, his work focuses on the impact of environmental contamination on Indigenous communities and on the restoration of ancestral land-based cultural practices. He also authored a number of books and texts about these critical issues, and many of them are on the reading list of the students at Kiuna. So this year, the theme of the Knowledge and Cultures Week is territory. So you will all understand why it felt right to invite Mr. Alfred at Kiuna. Well, not exactly at Kiuna, but through Zoom on the virtual Mdakina, the territory of the Abenaki of Odanak. So Nyawan for being with us, Mr. Alfred. I now yield you the mic.
Nyago, merci beaucoup. It's an honor to be here. I've heard a lot about Kiuna, and I've always wanted to visit and participate in the programs. Mostly I've heard it from my friend Alex McCumber, who had a long relationship there. And so I think there's been a couple of times when I almost made it out there to to visit and to make a contribution. So I'm very happy to have been invited and to be able to participate in this. So thank you very much. And thanks to all the students and participants in the conference for joining this and listening to what I have to say today. So I'm looking forward to sharing my thoughts and things that I have learned over the years, being involved in Indigenous politics now since 1987. So it's been quite a while on a journey of learning about what that question is. What does territory mean to Indigenous people? And so what is territory? What is the land? And what is our relationship to the roots in our homeland, physical and spiritual and cultural? And I've been on that learning journey myself as a student in university, as a person in the community, listening and learning and trying my best to take in the knowledge of the elders and people who have come before. And then as a teacher in trying to share that in various ways in a university context for many years, and then also now in a community context, working with younger people and then just people who are committed to restoring the strength of our nation. So it's good to be here today among like-minded people, both Hongwe Native and our settler allies who are committed to supporting our nation's resurgence and revitalization, and also bringing justice to this society. And it feels good to be here talking. So I'm going to present some ideas, but I'm really looking forward to the exchange and having the discussion and learning from the people that are here today too. So with that, I'm gonna start off and present the main idea that I have for my contribution here today is looking at the idea of territory and land and kind of separating those two, just if you will. I mean, we look at the physical place that we come from and the physical places that we live in, and they're spaces that have multifaceted meanings, of course. And oftentimes in our political life as Native people trying to make change for our people, we're drawn into a certain way of looking at what land is. and what territory is, and conceptualize and speak about it and begin to relate to it in a certain way in order to interface with the systems that control our lives today and control that land. And so in that sense, when I hear the word territory from my work and the years that I've been involved in, I think about it kind of like in a legal way and in a political sense. So I understand it very well from my training and from my work in terms of territory being defined in legal terms and using concepts and words that come from Europe and that have been embodied in Canadian law and the systems of power that control the land and our lives. And so that's why I can kind of separate territory from land. And I want to talk about both actually, because I think they're both very important. But just to kind of lay out the initial difference between territory and land. So territory for me is like lines on a map or descriptions in a negotiating document or a description of the characteristics or the boundaries of a piece of territory in a book somewhere, and the discussions that are around that. To me, when I hear territory, that's what I hear. And so that's the first distinction. To contrast it to that, when I hear land, it's come to mean something totally different to me. And I think for most people too, like if you think about the resonance of that word territory versus land, the land has a much more, in my mind at least, visceral, I get a visceral reaction. Like the land is something that I feel, that I experience, you know. So when I hear about land, it's the smell of it, it's the sense of it, it's the look of it, it's everything that you feel as a human when you're in relationship to a place. So place as a line on a map and a concept that can be negotiated or commodified or something like that, versus a relationship. And I think that's very important to understand when we're thinking about Native politics and about our nationhood and about restoring our ancestral ways and the relationships that we had in our communities. Because a lot of times, and too often times, I'd say, the distinction is blurred and it's not accounted for in the positions and the movements and the arguments and the actions that our political organizations are taking. And so the idea of our homeland, of our places that our people occupied for thousands of years and that are our birthright as territory, can be problematic if it doesn't really include and allow for the continuation and the resurgence of the relationship that we have as humans and cultures and spiritual beings to the land. That's my basic point, is that we need to be aware and conscious and really committed to the restoration of our relationship to our land, because the root of our existence as Indigenous peoples is our relationship to the land. Almost every Indigenous group in the world, not only in Quebec, in our region, or in North America, or in the Americas, but everywhere you go in the world, their identity, their sense of themselves, their idea of who they are circulates around the idea of themselves as the original people of that place. So it's very specific. And to stick with the kind of idea of territory versus land, it's not simply pointing to a particular area between two mountains or around a certain lake, or say using our own nation as an example. Taiaiake Alfred means there's various translations, but I think most people would agree. Taiaiake means people of the place of the flint, Blackstone, and it refers to a particular area in the central part of New York State, where there was a certain type of stone and rock, and the identification of the people with that area is specific. And so in one sense, that's a territorial acknowledgement. It's that delineation of the area on the globe. But the second you kind of go from looking at that place to looking at how the indigenous people of that area relate to it, you start to get into a much deeper sense of what that means. And so the idea that's embodied in all of our cultures, in our languages, is that those can only exist in that place. And that, in fact, all of our languages, all of our spiritual connections, all of our ceremonies, and all of that, which make us who we are as traditional indigenous people, come from that particular place. And the idea that you can be indigenous anywhere else other than that particular place, so that you can be a Mohawk in the desert, or you can be a Mohawk in the Arctic or on the West Coast, is very recent, and I think a natural kind of outflow of the colonial relationship and kind of our modern reality. But it's not something that in our ancestral ways that existed. And everything that I've learned and everything I've heard is that all of us indigenous people are rooted in particular places, and that our existence is really an expression of the human being's relationship to the natural environment in that area, and the spiritual forces that exist in the sacred places and manifest in those sacred places. And so it's a very different, much deeper, fuller sense of a relationship to a place than simply being a human being who happens to exist for this time in that territory, in that bounded sphere on the earth. And I think that this difference is the root of a lot of the conflicts that exist and have existed between indigenous people and non-indigenous people. In that, of course, when Europeans came over from another part of the world to this area here, by definition, they were uprooting themselves and came to a new land in order to reestablish communities and to exploit for economic purposes, or to escape persecution, or whatever the main reasons were. But by definition, those societies, those cultures are transient. And the spirituality that came with it, Christianity at the beginning, the culture that came with it, this kind of emerging capitalist commodifying culture, were designed for transience and to move through the world, identifying territories for settlement / exploitation. And the people that came here and the societies that developed were in no way rooted in territory in the same way, and could never be rooted if they exist within that culture in the same way as the indigenous peoples. And so the indigenous peoples very, very strongly, as we all know in the history of our cultures and our families and our communities, very, very strongly resisted the idea of being dispossessed, not only in terms of territory, but being dispossessed in having our relationships cut, our relationships severed, basically our lifeline to who we are severed. And I still think that this is a problem in Canada's conception of justice for Indigenous people. There's this idea of justice that has emerged I don't want to put it in such objective terms like emerged, as if the government has suddenly realized they're wrong and they need to make things right and so forth. Like, let me just be clear when I say emerged, it's through the struggle and sacrifice of Indigenous people who have fought hard to survive, to resist, and to have brought forward, along with people in the larger society that have signed on to that struggle and committed to it, that have brought forward the idea of justice and that have made Canadian governments and elites in the society respect the idea of our continued survival and the need to acknowledge and support that. But what's embedded in that idea of justice now, when it's manifested in terms of land claims and negotiations over compensation and land and so forth, is still remnant of that idea of the idea that land is territory, and it's something that can serve humans in terms of the development of their economies and their social development and so forth, and that it's really not imbued with respect for the sacred and the spiritual and the cultural needs of that community for their continued existence in that place. And so, and as an example, I'll say, when we talk about land claims justice, usually the attraction for Indigenous people getting into a land claim negotiation or pushing the idea of their title in court or something like that is the fact that they can have their territory recognized. And the governments of Quebec and Canada and other provinces as well kind of come to the negotiating table with the assumption that Indigenous people are going to gain some recognition of ownership over that territory. But the only reason they're involved in these negotiations is because they're assuming, and sadly, most oftentimes they're right these days, that the Indigenous group advancing those positions have the same objective in regard to the land as the government. So if you're pursuing a land claim, the governments assume that whatever the result of that land claim is in terms of recognition on a map of your territory might increase from a little Indian reserve that you have to hundreds of square miles or thousands of square miles of title recognition. They're assuming that you're going to want to get in on the uses of the land that are ongoing. So they're assuming that you're acknowledging the inevitability of the colonial project and colonialism, in that you're negotiating your participation in the exploitation of your land with the same intention of developing it to increase the economic prosperity of your community. And that's a fair enough point, these days, where our communities are, of course, deprived of fair compensation and have been deprived of the use and the benefit in economic terms of our own homelands for many years. And so it's hard to really criticize anybody who comes into a land claim negotiation for wanting to increase the economic prosperity of their community so people can have better houses and better services and better access to education and funding and so forth. So I'm not criticizing the bare objective of trying to increase prosperity, but it's that other part that I'm talking about that is either ignored or actively suppressed in these negotiations and in the whole concept of justice in Canada. That is a severe problem, I think, for our people in the long run. And a lot of the work that I've done that's reflective of my experience in being involved in negotiations, because I've been a land claim and a self-government negotiator in Kahnawake, and I was for many years, and also worked in British Columbia in the treaty process here and so forth, and elsewhere I've consulted. But the insight that I have from being involved in those processes is that the short-term gain from participating in and conceptualizing our return of our homelands in territorial senses tied to capitalist exploitation of the land is extremely detrimental to our long-term survival as Native people, because there is a clear continuation of the idea of dispossession, not only in terms of physical movement, like we're in the way, we need to move, we need to make room for other people's use of the land. But so getting back in on participating in those processes may make sense in economic terms, in terms of jobs and shared benefit agreements and so forth. But the further we get away and the further we are dispossessed from our relationship to the land in the way that it defines us as Indigenous people, and the sustenance we get from it spiritually, culturally, physically, the less and less we have of a connection to our ancestral root. And you can only stretch that so far. You can only stretch that so far before it breaks. And our ancestors, our elders have been telling us that, and oftentimes I think about it, and I've spoken about this before because it just continues to resonate with me as an idea that if you think back maybe 300 years ago or 200 years ago, and put yourself in the era of the fur trade, which all of our peoples our history is enmeshed in here in this conversation. And you think about somebody coming to a negotiation. So put yourself, say, in Lachine in the 1600s or 1700s, and you got a clan mother and you got a chief. You're deciding, should we participate in this? What's the costs and the benefits of making some money, participating in the killing of beaver, which goes for money, which goes against our traditional teachings and sense of what's sacred or not. But look at the benefit, and we're allowing newcomers into our community. It's disrupting. There's all these things, and I'm sure people at the time were well aware of that. It's not like they're any different than us in terms of their intelligence or anything like that. They're well aware of the trade-offs and the benefits of what was happening. But the one difference between them and us is that you think of the cultural foundation that they were coming at that decision from. Think about how strong they were in their understanding of themselves as Indigenous people, as a Punui. Language, spirituality, cultural practice, community, lived experience in that territory. They were the full experience there, And a trade-off for them was probably a very small impact on their ability to continue as Indigenous people in the framework of their ancestors. So I always think of this kind of a metaphor of a rock. So they're standing on a foundation that's like a giant rock. It's like a huge one. It's deeply connected. There's thousands of people. They're one of many people who continue that language and know those ceremonies and all the words for all the plants in that territory and everything like that. And so to have a few coureurs de bois come into the community and do what they did and stuff, that's kind of a minimal impact. They could handle it. And there's no question that they were going to be able to continue on and that their communities were going to continue on. Now, they didn't know. With hindsight, you might question that and say, oh, they made a mistake. But we can't say that at the time because anybody would have made that same calculation. But so compare that situation now to the one we have now, where you and I are coming to a negotiation, or any Indigenous leader is coming to negotiate a relationship to land and whether or not they should allow more development, more industry, more exploitation, or whether they should resist that. So oftentimes I explain it in terms of say that leader's name, as is in our community, names carry on. And so there was a person named Taiaiake, my name, in my family line back then, and it might have been him standing there with the clan mother telling him what to do and stuff. But it could be that person. So that Taiaiake from the late 1600s and early 1700s, compare him to me. So I wouldn't want to face up against that person in any way, physically, spiritually, culturally, and have to challenge, who's more indigenous. Clearly, that person was better able to carry on a representation of what it was to be Taiaiake. In the interim, we've suffered the impacts of colonization, and we've suffered the losses and the harms. And people of my generation and our generations going forward are the legacy of that. And so I'm thinking about it, rather than standing on that big boulder of a cultural foundation with confidence, I'm kind of balancing on a tiny little rock, trying to maintain myself as a cultural being in a spiritual sense as I'm going away, and also negotiate a relationship to land with outsiders who are continuing to come and wanting to dispossess us even more in all of those senses. So the logic is clear in my mind today that we can't afford any more sacrifice of our relationship to land in that spiritual, cultural sense to benefit ourselves economically, even though the economic needs are great. That line has been stretched, or to continue with the analogy that I'm using, that boulder, that rock has been continually blasted away to the point where it's so small that me and my kids and the coming generations have very little to stand on as a cultural foundation. And if we lose that cultural foundation entirely, we're lost. We're wandering. And we become just like the people who came from Europe, who were transient. So if our connection is lost, to restate it, we're no longer representing the life way and the existence of our ancestors in that place. We're also transient people, and colonization has completed its mission of making us all transient, and thus opening up the land for exploitation fully. Because really the only thing in Canada that's stopping capitalism from completely ruining all of these landscapes is the existence of Indigenous peoples and the ideas that we have about how to use land in a just way. Environmental movements today are fairly effective in bringing that consciousness into the larger society about the trade-offs, and becoming more effective, I think, in organizing to stop the most blatant harmful exploitations, and then to also address some of the previous exploitations in terms of cleanups and remediation and so forth. But all of that doesn't come from Europe. All of that comes from what Europeans have and Euro-Canadians have learned from Indigenous people. Our philosophies, our ideas, our practices, everything that we've carried forward from generations of knowledge, many generations of knowledge and practice by our ancestors, and the formulation of that into, by necessity, in the modern era, a political ethic or a political ideology of resistance on the Indigenous side, and environmentalism on the non-Indigenous side. Now, granted, there's been some Europeans, of course, who have come to value and are able to think through and rationalize the value of the land independently. But you can trace the environmental movement in its root to a consciousness that arises from an Indigenous perspective on the natural environment, and the roots of it are there. And this thing, which is such a strong oppositional force to the complete devastation of the landscapes that we all live in and depend on for survival is really dependent on and driven by Indigenous ideas and activism. You think about all the major environmental movements and major environmental victories that have happened, and there's Indigenous resistance at the root of it. And I think the reason for this is that we still have in our communities that continuing connection. There's still people, in spite of colonization, in spite of the fact that all of our minds have been warped and we've had ideas forced on us and we've been dispossessed from our ancestral ways and so forth. In spite of all of that, there's still this connection in our communities. I'm sure everybody sitting here who's Native can picture, or who knows, you will know someone or a family or a group of people who maintain that idea of indigeneity that our ancestors would recognize and relate to, in spite of all of the losses and chaos that exists in our communities otherwise. I know that's the fact in Kahnawake. And everywhere I go, there's suffering and there's chaos and there's confusion, and there's anger and all these kind of things, but there's also that connection. And the latest kind of turn or development in Indigenous resistance is in the last 10 years or so, I'd see in different Native communities, of a recognition of the fact that decolonization is really about restoring those connections, about enlivening and breathing life back into those ancestral ways so that we can transform our existence as individual people relating to each other, as communities relating to the land, and then in a larger sense, we can embody an idea of what it means to be human in relation to a natural environment for the rest of the world. And that's decolonization. Everything that happened before that, we didn't really know it in this way. We didn't know it while we were in it. But everything that's happened in terms of political struggle and resistance and blockades and all this kind of stuff and legal challenges and all that has kind of crystallized into the idea that we need to re-embody the relationship that our ancestors had with their natural environment. And we need to relearn what it is to be Indigenous in those terms. So the whole idea of adapting to the new reality of the capitalist world that's been brought into this sphere here is delegitimized, and rightly so. For many years, our Indigenous resistance was about developing the skills, reshaping ourselves, taking the best of both worlds and kind of fitting in, getting our place at the table kind of phrase. I don't know if it's the same in French, but in English, they say taking our place at the table. Well, that may make sense 20 years ago, where people were looking at this society as kind of the epitome of human development and technological development and so forth. But sad in one sense because of the impacts on the earth, but it's good that society has been delegitimized as a model with climate change and all of the things that are happening, and all of the corruption and so forth that we've found in government, and all of the criticisms that have come forward of just the way the society is organized. It's not really anything to aspire to anymore on the part of Indigenous people. And I think people generally recognize that. And so the idea of assimilating or finding our way in a neoliberal society is not something that really holds a lot of sway in the younger generation of activists and I won't say younger generation, just people who are concerned with the survival of our nation. What really does hold a lot of sway is addressing that emptiness at the core of who they are as Ungwahue that drives a lot of the negativity in their lives. And it's come to be very clear through the work of scholars and through the work of people in the community who have maintained their existence in really traditional ways. But it's come to be very clear that the way to address that harm and that emptiness is through reestablishing yourself in relation to your homeland. And that's a major turn in scholarship and in understanding of what colonization and decolonization is in the last 10 to 15 years. And you could see it having such huge impacts in terms of not only cultural practices and healing movements and so forth, but even in terms of its translation into a set of political commitments and objectives. So the idea of reestablishing our rooted existence in our homelands and fighting for not only the right to do that, but the means to be able to do it in terms of having the land represent a sacredness, to be able to engage in the land in that relationship to sustain ourselves in a sacred and cultural sense and a physical sense is becoming very clearly the prime objective of activism among the newer generation of people. And it's no longer a sense of trying to gain recognition of territory to participate in that exploitative economy. And it's causing some very exciting and interesting challenges among Indigenous people in terms of generational differences between the established leadership in the community and the objectives that they have in relation to achieving justice, and the younger generation who are, of course, now much more critical, and rightly so, and naturally, of those objectives and wanting something much more reflective of their priorities. Okay, so you can see it's, I hope I'm conveying it in a way where you can see it's kind of a natural evolution in this process of decolonization. So remember the analogy I used before of, the previous generation being much more culturally strong and more amenable to some compromises in order to achieve economic benefit. But that's even, you don't have to go back 300 years for that. I mean, you can even see that in the last 50 years, 50 or 60 years, even within one or two lifetimes. The previous generations having the language, having the cultural practice, and not feeling threatened by some compromise, because they grew up speaking the language, they grew up with their grandparents, they learned all this knowledge, and they had access to the land. And so to make some compromises there wasn't such a big deal for them. It was worth it, put it that way. And then you got some people born now in the 1980s and 90s who didn't have access to that, who don't speak their language, who never experienced the land in the way that the previous generations did, feeling alienated from their own homeland and their own heritage. And any sort of compromise is too much. And any sort of talk of economics and finance and commodification and all that is off the table for them. It's all about what can you do to facilitate my reconnection and my relationship. And I don't mean it to be in such an individual sense, but as people, what can we do to restore that connection? Because the priority for them, and I notice from my own existence now, comparing my I guess arrangement of priorities in my own mind today versus 30 years ago or 20 years ago is different. And the priority that I have in my mind, and I recognize in a lot of my colleagues and friends who are involved in this as well, is shaped by our understanding of what drives the pain of colonial existence. So we used to think it was because we were left out of what was happening, and that was an idea put on us by the larger society. You think back to the more overtly racist rhetoric and attitude that existed 30, 40, 50 years ago, where it was driven home to a lot of us and in the larger society that natives are backwards and their cultures are obsolete, and you need to come up with the times, and you need to update your existence so that you can be successful. And the reason you're not successful, meaning the reason you don't have a house like everyone else, and the reason you don't have access to jobs and you can't speak like everyone else, the reason you're not successful in this liberal society is because of your culture, and because you have not done the work to bring yourself to have the set of skills and capacities that everyone else has in order to make it. And so a lot of our grandparents and great-grandparents were affected by that. And they identified the pain that they had inside and the feeling of loss that they had inside with that failure to make it, with that failure to come forward to modernize. So the idea of modernization, closely tied to the idea of assimilation, is very strong. In the meantime, in the succeeding years, those of us that came afterwards realized that really wasn't the root of the pain. If it was having more money, having better houses and access to education and all that would be the solution, and we'd all be happy and healthy and celebrating life every single day. Now, some of us are. We found ways, and the happiness does exist, of course. But I think everybody participating here knows that Indigenous life in Quebec and elsewhere and all over the world isn't generally characterized as happy and healthy. And so our happiness and health and the meaningfulness of our existence, it's become very clear, is not tied to socioeconomic elevation of our communities. Some of the richest, in financial terms, communities in an Indigenous world are beset by suicide, drug abuse, social pathology, all these kind of things, to a much greater degree than others. So money doesn't really have anything to do with it. So the idea of assimilation and integration has been proven to not be the solution to the colonial burden that we carry in our bodies. And that's become clear only through experience. So it's just like my grandmother and my great grandparents thought that that's the way to do it, and that they identified that pain as being failures or being forced out and not having access to it. That's still there, even in the midst of people, even in the culture and in the bodies of people who have made it in those terms. So it has to be rooted somewhere else. Just think of the logic there. If that was the solution, we'd be resolved. Our colonial problem would be resolved, but it's not. You can still trace the same ailments, psychological, psychophysical effects of colonization today in people living as Indigenous people, even in elevated socioeconomic and socioeconomic terms and realities. So the root of it, as we found, by putting study into it, by listening to people, by paying attention to what people are feeling, and by a greatly increased culture of sharing and thinking through in very honest ways about what the sources of the pain in our lives are, we found that it's alienation from our land. And why I could talk for an hour, or 10 hours for for the next 10 years, as I've been talking about it for the last 10 years, about this disconnection, because I think we finally realized that that is the place we need to focus on. And I remember doing an interview with Oren Lyons, who is the Onondaga faith keeper, and he's very well known all over the world and very respected individual in our communities and elsewhere. And there's one phrase he's told me that really resonated with me all these years later, still sticks with me. I think I was asking him something about identity and how, what it is to be Okohoe and stuff. And he goes, well, you don't really need to look elsewhere to find out who you are. He said, your identity is where the old roots of your family go into the earth. So where your old roots go into the earth, that's who you are. And for me, that's kind of stuck with me. I've had to think about the meaning of that for a long time, and it continues to come back and means different things. And it's kind of like a simple statement, but it means so much, and it can give you so much. And what is it when the old roots, your heritage, everything you know as to what it is to be a Native person is not able to connect? That's where the source of loss and alienation comes. It's that inability to connect and to feel that connection and to live it out and to really embody in your life and to be able to pass on language to your kids, to be able to listen and take in teachings from the elders, to be able to feel the power of the natural environment, and to be able to share and carry out your obligations as an Indigenous person to the birds, to the plants, to the fish, to the whole natural environment. If colonialism, because of occupation by other people, newcomers, or because of law preventing you, or because of pollution as a result of industrial activities, makes that territory, that land, unsafe, unhealthy. If you're not able to live out that connection of your heritage reflected through you into that land, that's a serious harm. And it's for me, that's what colonization kind of really boils down to, is that we are not able to carry on. And it's the alienation and the frustration and the anger, and in a lot of cases, unfortunately, the despair that comes from recognizing that, either consciously or just feeling it, even if you don't think through it and understand it in a conscious way. The feeling of not being able to carry on the existence that you know is your true existence, and having to live someone else's vision of yourself, or just being caught, even worse, being caught between the two and not really feeling part of either one. That's where those feelings that come from, that drive the need to harm ourselves and to dull the pain and to do the kind of things that, or just lead to a despair that causes us to wander and go off and not live in healthy ways. So if that's the cause, the root cause, to stick with that metaphor, the objective of politics and the objective of our work, no matter whether we're in politics or scholars or community work and so forth, becomes very clear. It's to restore that connection. And then you have an agenda that makes sense for the coming generations. It's an agenda driven by the restoration of our relationship to the land, rather than grabbing territory. And so that's not to say that when you come to this realization that everything is all boom solved and easy, because of course it's just an agenda now. It's kind of like a reset, and I think we're starting to recognize this reset. It's been since the early 2000s that I started to kind of think about things in a very critical way, with this mentality. And since then, it's become very clear to me. And I think since then, it's become very clear to a lot of people who have been working on these issues, because, we worked on this idea of the Indigenous resurgence to contrast with the idea of reconciliation. In my mind, reconciliation is another, I've even titled lectures, reconciliation is recolonization, to make the point. But I truly believe that reconciliation is a recolonizing, because what it wants us to do is to reconcile with the existence of colonial society on our homeland. So it wants us to reconcile that, and it wants us to reconcile with the fact of our dispossession. And instead, I think we need to reconcile with our ancestors. We need to reconcile with the fact that we're not able to carry on their way of being, their existence. And we need to acknowledge that, and we need to fight to restore that and to live out our responsibilities in that way. And so the idea of Indigenous resurgence emerges from that, in the sense that there needs to be a reset of the political struggle, the political movement, rooted in an idea of restoring ourselves on an individual and collective basis, on a lived embodiment level, and also on a cultural sense, according to our ancestral understandings of who we are, and as best as we can move forward in the world, drawing on the sense of self and the sense of how to be a good person in this world from our ancestral ways, as opposed to from a liberal worldview that evolved out of capitalist exploitation of our territory. So once you realize that that's the agenda, then there's a whole set of new political struggles and intellectual struggles that have taken place. And I think we've come to the point where intellectually, over the last 15 years, we've laid out a clear understanding of this. There's a lot of people doing good work on this. For people who care to read and listen and investigate this problem on the mental level and on the intellectual level, there's a lot of resources out there. And the work from 15 years ago till today is ongoing. People are digging deeper and deeper at this question in the way that this colonial thing manifests. I mean, I've talked about it on a certain level. So it's a different discussion, but we could talk about it on a different level in terms of the way it manifests socially and in personal relationships and so forth. There's a lot of different critiques of the way that we've embodied colonialism, and that has been really focused on looking at it within the family, within the community, within personal relationships lately. And that, to me, that's taking it even further to the micro level, and asking us all to really take seriously the idea of this personal investigation into how colonialism has shaped our ideas and the way we are. And so that's fantastic. Like that has to continue to happen. But we're here talking about territory, and territory means, for Indigenous people, the two things that I talked about. And then once you understand it, once you read all these books, once you listen to these YouTube lectures, and once you encounter your teachers telling you this, the essential question is, what do you do about it? How do you channel your political energy? Because after that, as a Native person, it's pretty hard to go work for the government with any good conscience. I know this for a fact for myself. It's pretty hard to go work for the government and maintain the status quo, or help bring better programming. You're not doing harm in trying to bring services and all that. But if you're a political activist and you're someone who's really motivated to bring change, fundamental change, it's pretty hard to work in those environments and justify that in your own mind. So when you're thinking about where you're going to channel your energy, if you're a younger person, say in your 20s or even younger, you have a lifetime ahead of you of work, 40 years, 50 years. Where are you going to channel that? More and more, it's becoming clear that people are committed to channeling their energy and constructing a practice, whatever field they're in, whether it's law or social work or governance, political science, constructing a practice that's going to help people facilitate that restoration of their existence within their homeland. And so that's the framework that I'm operating in today. Like I've worked, as I mentioned a couple of times now, in coming at this problem in different ways, because those were the channels that were available to me when I first started working. I was 24 years old as a student at Concordia in Montreal, and studying political science. And my first opportunity to get involved in this was working in self-government and land claims negotiation in Kahnawake. And so I worked in that kind of context of seeing land as territory and trying to negotiate legal arrangements that allow us to take advantage of what was out there. So I've seen that. I've worked in more militant movements around resistance and supported and participated in British Columbia in trying to foster a more critical politics around that. And that I would characterize as sort of the resistance movement. And resistance is, in my mind, just to be clear, necessary and beneficial to the advancement of our people towards our objective of restoring nationhood. But it's also kind of a limited, it's kind of a limited horizon in terms of achieving the goals that I'm talking about here, the restoration of people. Because when you're in resistance, you're always focused on the other person who's in power. So you think about the word resistance, it's like you're resisting someone else's power, and you're fighting back, and you're trying to hold back something that's unjust coming to suppress your people. And that's actually what resistance is in Canada today, because there's these huge forces that are still there, trying to take us from the land, trying to impose law, trying to do all the things that capitalism and neoliberalism does on our territory. So I've worked in the kind of reconciliation industry, I've worked in resistance. But now it's becoming more and more of an option, I'd say, for people to participate in resurgence as well. So the victories that we've gained, the recognitions that we've forced people into, have created these spaces where there's opportunities now to be able to actually work and to channel your energy into doing the thing that we're now identifying is at the core of decolonization. And so I'm really happy to kind of be able to offer that to younger people, to say that if you're into resistance, there's all kinds of opportunities for that. And of course, if you're into reconciliation, that's the whole hegemonic framework today. There's all kinds of jobs and opportunities for you to participate in the maintenance of neo-colonial realities in our community, some of which have benefits. As an aside, some of which have minor benefits in spite of the larger trade-offs. So I'm not judging anyone for whatever their commitments are in that, as long as they're not doing harm to our people. But if you're a younger person thinking about a career and life focused on the core struggle, which is this connection, there's a lot of opportunities. And the way that I would look at it is, it's a whole relationship. So there's the people, there's individuals, and there's a whole sense now in our communities about the necessity for healing. There's structures, there's opportunities, there's resources for healing, accessing traditional knowledge and Indigenous teachings and methods and medicines and so forth. So there's that kind of place that you can work at in this whole relationship of resurgence. There's also the political and structural facilitation of movement and of connection between people and the land. And that's in the terms of the way people conceptualize in different organizational settings their priorities. So say if you want to make, just as an example, you work in child and family services or something like that, there's an increasing recognition of the fact that we need to develop ways and mechanisms to restore this connection. And so there's opportunities to work in that environment too. At the base, though, there's the recognition of the need that we need to focus on the healing of the land itself and the preservation of the integrity of the natural environment. And for me, in the last 15 years, as I've come to commit myself to this structure of decolonization as opposed to others, it's been at that level that I've been doing most of my work and my experiences in terms of looking at the land and the impacts of colonization on the land, and looking at ways in which people can participate in restoring the health of the land and addressing some of the major harms that have come. And then I've had opportunity to participate in the actual restoration of a relationship on a small scale, but still meaningful, of that whole relationship, where the land issues have been addressed, pollution has been remediated, recognition of rights has been achieved, and so forth. Then we built structure to facilitate younger people benefiting from the existing knowledge of the elders, and to facilitate this new, which is, I say new, but let's say renewed relationship, and to begin to set in place a structure where people can begin to interact and to live their lives in the ways that their ancestors would have envisioned that. The main place that I did that work was in Alpasasne. And I want to talk about that a little bit, but I've been talking for quite a while, and maybe I'll take a little break and allow people to, or open the opportunity for people to ask questions or anything at this point before I turn to another focus.
Now, and Mr. Alfred, so now's the time for questions. You can either write them in the chat, or you can also raise your hand so we unmute you and you can speak. The way to do that is to click on participants, and then there's a button that says raise hand. So you can go either way. And I think Mr. Alfred understands French. So if you have a question in French, you can go ahead, and in case I'll translate.
And I can see the ones in the group chat. I don't know if do you want to moderate, or should I just jump in at the questions?
I'll look at the chat. For now, there's no question, but whenever they pop up, I'll let you know.
I see one from Jessica Rose Lacroix.
Yeah, we now have, oh, Jessica. So yeah, maybe you can answer that question. So Jessica's question is, in your opinion, can there be reconciliation without resistance, or are they too symbiotic in nature to have one without each other? And I also see questions from Miguel and Keziah, so I'll get to you guys. Okay.
Thank you, Jessica Rose. It's a very good question that I've been grappling with for many years, and I think I understand it. So I'll share my understanding now of the relationship between resistance and reconciliation. It's actually something that we've been talking through for at least, I would say, I wrote this book with Saze that I wrote between 2001 and 2004. And so I remember having these discussions while I was writing that. So it's been, almost 20 years that we've been looking at this question, because during that period, we had we had the emergence of a re-emergence of militant resistance, especially in British Columbia. West Coast Warrior Society, Native Youth Movement, a lot of collaborative actions and alliances with anarchists, non-Indigenous anarchists, and this whole idea of anarcho-Indigenism kind of started a little bit to take root. And so resistance was very much at the forefront in that era. And of course, the people that were running First Nations governance and so forth were committed to more of a reconciliatory framework. That wasn't explicitly called that at the time so much. It was negotiations of land claims agreements. It was negotiations of self-government. It was participation in the economy and so forth. Later come to be, very well identified with what we now know as a kind of reconciliation agenda. And so we've had to negotiate that among Native people as we go along, and it hasn't always been pretty. There's people on both sides, of course, that are very vehemently opposed to the other's idea of achieving decolonization. But I found most people in the middle are very willing to consider whatever is effective. So yeah, the main proponents of reconciliation, or like the champions of the government agenda, of course, hate the people who are out in the streets protesting and occupying buildings, and people like me funding them. But then on the other hand, you got the people who are very, very radical, in the classic sense of very radical militant, delegitimizing any participation of the government, and they hate those other people. But I found that those are like the far end of this political spectrum. In the middle, you got people who are committed to doing whatever they need to do to make life better for their kids and the future generations of natives. And they're willing to consider whatever the effective means are. And so over the course of 20 years of being involved in these movements, I found that if we ignore the fundamentalists on both sides, you have a recognition of, and this finally gets to answer your question. I think you have an idea that's still true, that we developed at the time of an understanding, is that the trajectory of decolonization, if we continue to focus on, say, what reconciliation tells us we should do, education, Western education, working on developing the means for economic independence of our communities, and health and human services, and all the kind of things that everybody else in Canada has. If we continue to work on that, there'll be a slow elevation of the existence of our people. And even if you discount what the end objective is, there's no denying that. Okay, so it's kind of like, where am I on the screen here? Maybe I should have had a little bit of a PowerPoint to show this, but so you have it like this. It's kind of going in that direction if you want to graph it out. Here's where resistance comes in, though. So those people that are committed to resistance and militancy and direct action and challenging government programs and so forth cause these kind of crises. We can name them. You got the Wet'suwet'en now. You got the lobster fishermen with the Mi'kmaq. You got Ganawage every couple of years. you got all these people all over the place who are more militant and who respond in a much more direct way, in a challenging way, than reconciliation allows legally. They're kind of like the problematic groups for the government, because they're not playing with this slow, easy, moderate agenda of decolonization. So these crises happen and they blow up. And if you study this as a political scientist, if you live through it, and if you study it, you recognize that it can be very effective as a means of advancing decolonization at a much higher rate than if you just let the reconciliation do its business. Because you create a crisis, it draws attention, it creates a necessity on the part of the government to resolve this crisis. it creates all kinds of energy, positive and negative, which can be taken advantage of to reset what moderate is. So moderate before Oka was like this. Let's just manage the problem. Let's just not kill them off anymore. Let's keep them in their place, but let's not kill them off. After our nation did what we did, and we had support of all these nations all over Canada, that wasn't enough anymore. After 1990, boom, the trajectory is here. So you see what I'm saying here in terms of resistance, kind of creating the opportunity to redefine what the objective is. And in terms of a person who's committed to this struggle, there's a bit of you have to be pragmatic, even if you're on the militant side. And we talk about this all the time in the resistance movement, is that you can't be expecting to accomplish all of your objectives every time you engage in the militant resistance. In fact, it's never been the case when a group of people who positioned and postured themselves around a radical set of objectives has achieved everything they wanted to in a crisis situation. It wasn't the case in 1990, and it's not the case with the Wet'suwet'en now, and it'll never be the case. But you have to see victory in terms of elevating the trajectory of that struggle, so that the people who are moderate, who are like 90% of natives, who are much more moderate and not always wanted to be on the front lines and not always wanted to be in a battle, will see that they can take advantage of that new space that's been created, how the discourse has been changed, how there's political and legal space to be able to do something a little bit different. They'll take advantage of that, and they'll institutionalize it through negotiations and so forth. So there's kind of a dynamic that I've just outlined for you is something that kind of emerged in real-time discussions as we were conducting direct action militant challenges and facing resistance from established Native leaders in order to rationalize for ourselves why we were doing it. And it's held. And I think the logic of it holds. I've talked about this many times since then. And I think that it's a way of really bridging for the middle group, the majority of the people who are involved in this struggle, a bridging and kind of rationalizing a cooperation between people who are committed to radical perspectives and direct action and people who are committed to more moderate taking advantage of what's here. And so if you can see each other in this kind of necessary dynamic, then we're going to get some. And we have, there's been some Native leaders over the course of the last 20 years who unfortunately were so compromised in their allegiances that they acted against Native movements and individuals who were militant or radical and cooperated with the state in suppressing them. But for the most part, I have to say, from my experience, most Native leaders in Native communities and in Native organizations are on side with the idea of taking advantage of that political space that militant politics creates. And they may not publicly say so, but they're smart enough to recognize the dynamic. And they give respect to people who put themselves out on the line. And I think that people who are involved in militant politics too, it's harder to acknowledge the role of the ones who take advantage of your hard work and sacrifice and moderate it. It's harder to do that, but I think that if you've been in it long enough, you recognize that this is just the way things are and this is the way change happens. And you kind of accept your role as being a person who puts out the hard work and sacrifices in order for incremental change to happen. And in order for that to happen, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens in a vacuum of law and organizational power. And there needs to be people in that milieu who understand that and who work. And for me, being kind of in between the two, the way I see it is that as long as people who are negotiating at the end of these crises that emerge every now and then from resistance action, respect the sacrifices of the people who are on the front lines and don't sell them out or throw them under the bus, whatever the phrase is that you want to use. As long as they don't do that, I respect the work that they do too.
You may have noticed that there's a poll going on, so please take a few minutes to answer it. It's only it's not a few minutes, a few seconds really.
Okay.
Just answer it because it's going to provide important feedback for the organizers. And next in line, we have Keziah, who wanted to ask a question. So I've unmuted you. Keziah, you should be able to talk.
Okay, so I feel like you touched on the idea and the concept of capitalism and how this view kind of came from comes from Europeans and when they came over and how they kind of used this idea and stuff and they exploit indigenous lands. But I also want to touch on the subject of self-reliance and how what's the way to move forward without exactly assimilating ourselves and losing ourselves to capitalism and to not harm the territory and the land in trying and find solutions or using solutions to basically fix our economical and unemployment issues in indigenous communities. That makes sense.
Thanks for that question. It's a one for all of us who are involved in education, I think, and who are leaving. Well, not even necessarily leaving communities. I was going to say leaving your community to go into higher education or training, but now it's even an issue for people who kind of stay there and take advantage of the programs that are brought into the community. It used to be when I started. It used to be where elders would say, literally, if you go to university, you're going to get assimilated and you'll never be back. And I kind of resented that when I first started. Like, oh, you're selling me short. But I've come to realize that there's good grounding for that perspective on the part of the elders when I started, because most people did. The education system was so assimilative and demanded so much of a surrender to a non-Indigenous, a whitewashing of a mentality that in fact most people didn't. Like, most people did assimilate socially, and if they did come back, they brought a mentality which is very different from the mentality of our people, and not in a good way. I think things have changed somewhat since then. Like, I started working at Concordia in 1993, and we formed a Native Student Center. There was other places at that time, like Trent University and some other places that had begun to accept the idea that having students, requiring students to assimilate, to forget who they are, to kind of wholesale adapt to non-Indigenous realities just to get an education and gain the skills necessary to benefit their communities and families was wrong. That we need to do something about that. And so at Concordia, I have to acknowledge somebody. Gail Guthrie Valaskakis was the dean at the time of arts and science, and she had a long history in Native education in Quebec and in Canada. And she was the one who hired me, and she basically told me that what we need is a face and a place for Native students to feel comfortable at this university. and we need to have a place where they can recognize themselves and be themselves, so that they can do the work they need to do and not have to feel like they're compromising their existence. Basically, we need an indigenous space here, and we took that mandate and we began the work of doing that, and that was simultaneous. It turns out with similar realization among a lot of different people, to be able to offer students the opportunity to at least have the chance of maintaining themselves as Ongwehue, as a Native people, while engaging. And my experience personally, like as a student, and then building and running programs, has been mixed. It's not easy. It's not. Some people would say still, I think, in a negative sense, that it's not possible. That the only way to fully realize yourself as an Indigenous person is through Indigenous knowledge in Indigenous context on the land. It's a strong perspective, and I don't entirely disagree with it. But I do think still that there's utility, usefulness, and power in gaining access to the knowledge and the resources that non-Indigenous society has used to oppress us for so long. The question for me has always been, how do I maintain my accountability to my own people? So I recognize that there's a lot of different ways to approach education. And a lot of it has to do with just your own personality as an individual person. Sure, there's different objectives among communities and too, but what I found is like there's ways and levels of comfort that people have based on their own cultural knowledge or lack thereof, that where they demand a greater or lesser degree of support or validation in the university system in order to maintain themselves at that level of comfort. So if you grow up speaking, I don't know, but like if you grew up speaking your language and participating in your culture and so forth, you go to a university, you may not need that much of a support. You embody that, you bring it with you, and it's different than somebody who grew up, maybe who was coming from a family that left the reserve or who was adopted out and wants to come back and is using the university as a means to reconnect with his or her culture, with their culture. Then you need a lot of support. You benefit from all kinds of opportunities and things that are set up there. So everybody's kind of different, but I think the thing that unifies everybody is that in order for this to be decolonizing as opposed to assimilative, is the ways in which we continue to account for ourselves in the context of our nations and our cultures and our communities. So I went to Concordia. It was very easy for me as an undergrad. I'll use an example of the two places I went to school as a contrast. So I went to Concordia before 92. Like I went in 87 as an undergrad, and there was nothing in terms of Native support. There's no acknowledgement of anything Native. It was straight up just university doing what universities do. There was no Native Student Center. There was no Native courses at all. No Indigenous studies, nothing. But I think I did a pretty good job of maintaining myself. But the reason was that I lived in Kahnawake. The university was 15 minutes from my home. My whole life, everything was reflective of me being a Kahnawake, just driving into school to doing what I need to do and then driving back home. So it was very easy to maintain that, like in a physical sense and in a cultural sense and so forth. So that's one example of how I maintain my accountability. So if I had come up with some ideas or took on a different political identification or something as a result of what I was studying or getting involved in student politics or whatever at Concordia, I'd have to account for that every day when I went home and sat around with my friends or talked to my family and walked around at Ganawag, everybody was looking at me like, what the hell are you talking about? That's not, that doesn't fit. And so I'd either have to justify it or abandon it. So that kind of direct accountability. So I contrast that to when I went to school at Cornell. So I did my graduate degree at Cornell. And even though it's only 5 hours away by driving, it's a different world. It's Ivy League, it's elite, United States, liberal-minded college. And the fact that I didn't go home every day, the fact that I had to live among the people that I was now studying with and learning from, and so it made a significant difference, and I felt that myself. I really felt it. And so at first, I think there was a danger of being drawn into that world because it has its attractions, right? Everybody knows it. The world has its attractions, the possibilities, the influence that you take on, and the flattering that you get, from being the native student and so forth. And I was lucky. And here's where I kind of drew from in order to do the work that I did at Concordia later on. I drew from the fact that obviously people had had this experience of finding it to be an assimilative environment, because somebody, the local First Nations people and the people of the Haudenosaunee had organized to support the establishment of a Native center there. And so for me, that was a major lifeline once I discovered it. The funny thing is I didn't even go there at first because I was one of those people like, oh, I'm from the res, like from Ganawagi. I don't really need those support services, that kind of thing. I had heard about a little bit, and then I had some sort of mini crisis in my studies. And then I went up to the Native Center, and then that was there, and then that was my connection, and it was like a whole new idea of why I was there at university. So I thought I was there just to empower myself, to gain education, to gain power and influence. And at one time I even thought like, oh, and here's how the ancestors were, right? I was like, oh yeah, what am I gonna do? I'm gonna get my graduate degree. I'm gonna go work as a spy for the, I don't know. I was studying East Asian studies. I was like, oh, I want to go to Japan and get involved in all that kind of stuff. That's how crazy it was at the time. And then, but I went to the Native Center and they were like, oh, you're finally here, like, come here. What are you doing working on Japan for? Why do you care about that? You'd be just another person, and you need to really focus on our communities and helping your community. And it kind of like ground that message in. And I got so involved, and it just seemed so obvious, like a day later I woke up like, what was I thinking? Of course I should be doing this. And from then on, my idea of contributions that we could make in university, beyond being a student, like being a student, your first job is to just pass your courses and do all your work. But then it's also paired with this idea of, well, as you develop and as you progress in university, you should also be thinking about how to make that place a place of resistance, resurgence, as opposed to just a place of survival. Yeah, and so for me, that's what the American Indian program was at Cornell, and I've always tried to elaborate on that going forward. Both at Concordia and then the work I did at EVIC for many years, is to try to look at it as a space of resistance where we had carved out a space where Indigenous people can be themselves without apology, without having to explain themselves to everybody, that people can come in and be who they are, think the way that they need to think, make the mistakes, do the things they need to do, without feeling like it was going to be a fatal mistake and they're going to end up gone, into that mainstream. That there was a supportive environment, a challenging but supportive environment for people to do that decolonizing work as well. And so the experience over my whole career was that the results are fairly uneven, and it really just depends on people's commitment individually to remaining accountable to their own people. And for me, there's a physical component to it too. Like, we can all say we're accountable, but until you go and sit and have people look at you, you sit in person and you have people and give them the ability to criticize you, to speak to you, to really put yourself in a position of answering to them, and respecting them enough to be able to say, well, I'm going to change if you lay out these criticisms that are real and that bring to light mistakes that I'm making or I've made. Then you're not really accountable. Like, a lot of people can just say, oh, I'm accountable, I sent my paper to so-and-so, or, everybody can watch my lecture on YouTube, and if they have anything to say, they'll say something. That's kind of a shaky accountability, but the physical, social, and cultural immersion of your sense of self in your community, I think, is true accountability. Because we know in our own Indigenous communities, if people disagree with what you're doing, or if they look down on it, they'll let you know. And there's a lot of ways for us to rationalize what we're doing. Any human being's brain is really good at rationalizing things that they're doing that benefit themselves. And if you just rely on your own rationalization, you'll find yourself doing crazy things, and your brain, the imperative is your brain to make you feel good about it. But if you sit in a circle with 40 or 20 of your relatives and friends and people in your own community and have to face their rationalizations of what you're doing, that's different. And I think that's where true accountability comes in. So it's a long, winding answer to your question, but it's something that I think that I've realized over time is, the imperative of colonialism is assimilation, and universities are structures of colonialism. So we have to acknowledge that they're inherently assimilative. And so we as individuals have to put the work into resisting that. And the best way, most effective way to do it is to remain rooted in our own community and answer to them, even when it means going against the imperatives of the university.
Sadly, our time together is running out. So the interpreter must go. But maybe, Mr. Alfred, if you still have a bit of time, we can take a few minutes to answer the last question from a student. So Sue, she asked whether you were raised in the territory, and if you often go there, and what do you do when you do go there?
Thanks, Swellen. Yes, I was born in Kahnawake territory. I was going to say in Kahnawake, not in Kahnawake proper. I was born in LaSalle, in Montreal, in the hospital in LaSalle. But as most people at the time I was born were born either in LaSalle or Lachine because of the hospital at the time. But yeah, I mean, a few hours later I was in Kahnawake. So I'd say I was born and raised in Kahnawake. And aside from military service, when I was 18 to 21 in the United States, I lived there until I was 32. So born and raised and grew up and had my life in Kahnawake until I was 32. And then I moved to British Columbia and began to work in the university over here on the West Coast, universities in the West Coast here, and started a family here. With my ex-wife is Wet'suwet'en, so a First Nations person from British Columbia. And so I got heavily involved in their politics and cultural practice and so forth over here in British Columbia. So I could say that I have both. You know, I I grew up and participated in Kahnawake life, and still do. One of the things I feel really lucky for in my life is that the whole time that I've been out here in British Columbia, my work life has kept me tied to Kahnawake and Akwesasne, which is our sister community, a little ways away from Kahnawake. And both in politics and then later on, say from 2004 onward, I didn't get a chance to talk about it, so maybe next time I visit Kiona, I could talk about the work in Akwesasne, but working on environmental restoration and restoration of traditional practices in a natural environment. So working with that community and designing a mentorship program that's language and cultural practice based. So for me, I learned so much in doing that work over 14 years that I feel super lucky to be able to say, like, even though I took advantage of the opportunity to come out and have this adventure on the West Coast and do the work that I did on the West Coast, I was able to maintain my connection, and I've traveled back and forth. I think the longest I've ever been away from Kahnawake has been 3 months. It was crazy for a while. I was traveling every 2 to 3 weeks back and forth. And I'm kind of back to that now. I live here on the West Coast, and I maintain my connection because I have sons. I have 3 sons. 2 are grown. I have a granddaughter now, another one on the way. And I have a young son who's 13. And I've always maintained my commitment to doing what I need to do as a father to them in the context of their culture, and teaching them about hunting and their land, their homeland, through their relatives. So I have a very close relationship with their family, in terms of knowing their territory and being able to, with their permission, of course, and mandate, carry out my responsibilities, even though I'm not Wet'suwet'en, to be able to roam around that territory and gain cultural knowledge and share it with my kids and other people in their nation. So I do that every fall and sometimes in the summer. We're big hunters, moose hunters. I'm proud about that. And so my sons are all into that. And then back in Kahnawake, most of my involvement is on the river. So I grew up, my family's place is not far from the river, right in the heart of Kahnawake. And so my main connection is to the river there. So that's my summer when I'm there.
So again, Nyawen, Mr. Alfred, for this great conference. I invite guests, if you want to continue your day of conference to the next one by Sophie Pagé-Sabouin. She will talk about the Crown's duty to accommodate Indigenous people when violating their rights. So quite a weird connection with this conference. And this is how, so please join me in thanking Mr. Alfred for this conference.
And thanks to all of you. And if anybody has any questions or wants to continue, my email, I think, is available, and just send an email if you have anything you wanted to ask me. Thanks, and good luck with the rest of the conference.